What's up, guys? Welcome to Northwest Arkansas Coders. This is the November of 2021 guest speaker. As always, our kind of mission here is to expose people to different tech stacks, to provide a safe place to learn and grow as people and developers. I'm really excited today because I got Lee Parham to volunteer his time and come give a really cool talk. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and give it to Lee.
Awesome. Thanks, Zach. So yeah, just to give a little bit of background on about myself. 10 years ago, I was a music professor living overseas and knew I was coming back to the States and was not going to come back into the American music world. And so I started to teach myself software engineering and went through a few curriculums and came back to Little Rock and knew enough to fake my way into getting hired. And so I did a lot of learning on my first job. It was a long process, interesting process. And so those of you that are getting started or anything, it's great to hear other stories. So find me after this and I like to hear your stories about getting started as well. I happened upon the one place in Little Rock that was a Rails shop, and that's what I had learned. And so I kind of got into the Rails ecosystem, worked for that company, Aptog, for about 4 years, made the switch to a fintech company and doing financial small business loans and stuff like that. And then recently accepted a position to be a developer engineer at Shopify. So I'm really stoked about that. So tonight, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about RSpec, one of the testing suites for Rails, kind of an entry into Rails, entry into RSpec, and kind of see how we structure these things. Test-driven development is near and dear to my heart, and in the Rails community, it's kind of the primary goal. And one of the first things we do is write tests. And so I'll be interested to know anyone else if they are also Rails, RSpec, and let me get started. So what we're going to do tonight is we're just going to build it within a class. Oftentimes you have to be kind of artificial. And so our project tonight is going to build a Rails app, backend at least, that hits the USPS address validator. And you'll pass it an address with XML. And what you'll get back is the validated address. And so we're going to go through building this app here together. So let's get started. I'm sorry, incidentally, a lot of what we use is, I'm going to point you to this resource right away, Better Specs. Better Specs has a lot of great information about RSpec and fantastic examples of not good ways and good ways to write things, and then plus a lot of discussion as well. So it's a lot of good stuff there. So if I'm referencing anything, I have likely stolen it from Better Specs. So let's get started. We're going to build a new Rails app. And you see I put a couple of flags in there. I put the -- API because we're not going to use the ERB templating. We're not really going to use the front end at all. And then I also included the -T to not include the basic testing infrastructure. And so let's go into that. And our server works. And you can't see it over here, but you can see the response here. Yes, I have a server. Great. So Rails is here. All right, so let's get started. What we're going to do first is what we have to do is do a little pre-work. At the end of this, I'm going to post a link to a repo that has all this. But one of the things you need is you need a credential for the USPS API. And Rails has this great way to do it, and it's encoded credentials. So now I have my credential in here. All right, let's get started. So what we're going to do first is we're going to add some of the, thank you for the Better Specs thing. It's great. It's Puma-like Express. Puma is the actual web server that Rails uses, and it actually does the socket management to receive the web requests and put them into the Rails routing. So we're going to start with the gem file. The gem file is where we store a lot of our libraries that we use, and we're going to insert a couple in the development test group here. I'm just going to overwrite this with my own. So one I use a lot of time in my development is called pry. It's a like debugger in JavaScript, and it allows you to interrupt. And we're going to use it to examine some things tonight. And then the magic, RSpec Rails. So we're going to do that, get it installed. And then there's a little install script that will allow us to do a lot of the generation for us as far as some of the test structure goes. All right, great. And so you can see now we have a spec folder, and we have these two files called a spec helper and a Rails helper. We'll look at those a little bit as we get into this, that help support the test running within Rails. So the other thing we're going to add is something called shoulda matchers. And the shoulda matchers are just a better way to be more semantic with the way we write things. And I'll show you one of the first specs we write will include this shoulda. And so we're going to get that installed real quick. All right. Now, a couple little last config things with this Rails helper. We're going to include a little bit of tests, and all this is in their repos on GitHub as well. So this is really pretty straightforward stuff, and I'm just going through this quickly just so we can get it set up. That does that. All right, so let's add our first model. We're going to call it a user model, but we're really not doing login sessions tonight. That's not the purview of this, but typically you have a user, and so we're going to add this. And Rails includes a lot of generators, so it makes a migration file for us, and it makes the base model class for us. And let's go ahead and write that migration. All right. So within the migration, we're just going to have a first name and a last name. And just because it's habit and users have email addresses for authentication, it's there. But we're not going to use that today, right? So this will create a little table with a first name and a last name in it, which is what we're going to need for our address validation. Then our users have addresses. So we're going to go ahead and just generate an address. And the addresses, let's look at what we have to do. And this is a little bit weird to see, but you can see with the user, we have a name. We have an address, and this is not my address. This is to a local Starbucks, and so we're just going to call it my home address. And we have the street, we have the city, we have the state, and we have the zip code. And so our database migration is going to include those things. Notice this T references user. This is the Rails way to also include then a user ID column and build the relation in the relational database that there's a user tied to an address. All right, so if we do this right, we should be able to migrate. All right, so now we have these two files. And let's see if we can include this now. Let's go ahead and actually let's check this real quick. So there we have our user, and our address will have the user ID to build the reference. So it has the street, city, state, and all that sort of stuff. There we are. All right. So what we want to do first is we want to build the Rails application code that defines this relationship within the Rails app between user and notice we already have a spec here. we're going to describe this user model. And first, what I just want to do is I want to write a test that says there is an association. And this is where that shoulda comes in to play. So this is a test, right? We describe our associations, and the user should have many addresses. Now let's see what happens if we run this right now. There's a couple different ways to run specs. In Vim, there's a great little test key. This is going to fail, by the way, because we haven't defined the address yet. Yeah, right? So congratulations. We wrote our first test and it failed like we wanted to. This expected the user to have a has many association called addresses, and there isn't one yet. So let's define that. That's as simple as has, name, not name. Okay. Now let's see if our test passes. There we go. Our test passed. The other way to run the test is down here, bundle exec, RSpec, and then spec, like a type, models, user spec. And there's our test. So our test passes. Now let's say, wait a minute, our business wants us to make sure that those addresses do belong to users. So let's go write the spec that would allow us to do this. And it's going to be very similar. In the Rails world, if you have a user has many addresses, that means an address belongs to a user. So let's run this test and see what happens. Ruby on Rails is absolutely object-oriented programming. Everything in Ruby is an object. Even the class is an object. Object is an object. Everything in the world is an object that inherits from something that inherits all the way back. So yes, it's absolutely object-oriented. So here we go. Expected address to have a belongs to association called user. And it's really handy. It's kind of nice. And so let's look at the address model now. And we can just define that. Belongs to user. All right. And now let's see if this test passes. Test nearest. So notice there's a few things here. My cursor is hovering over line 5, this line right here. So if I do test nearest, that's going to start where my cursor is and find the next available test to run right above my cursor. And right now it's that one. There's also test file that'll run the entire file. And there's also test suite that'll run the entire RSpec test library. And you can see right now we have just written 2 tests. And those 2 tests pass, and there are no failures. Ta-da. All right, so now let's get into the database real quick, and we're going to just create a couple of these, objects that we'll be able to use as we get into this. So I created a user. Here I am. And then there were no user addresses, so I'm associating, just like this, I can associate the address to this user right here. And so now I have use user.addresses. Yep, there's the address. And notice it's an array because I said has many. So it's not an array, it's a collection, excuse me. And there are the addresses there. And if I go to the first address, and then I can reference the user there. So we have that belongs to and has many relationships set up. All right, there we go. Now let's look back at our request and let's think about what we need to do next. And the first thing that comes to me is that if we're looking at this XML, and I love it that the United States Postal Service requires you to put XML as a query string and not as XML line, but that aside. If I notice something, I don't need a first name and a last name. I need a full name, right? We're not going to have first name, last name. So let's build the feature full name. And we're going to start by writing the test, as all good developers do. All right. And so this is going to get into the first little bit of nomenclature that is a sort of a good pattern. Notice my first describing associations had a dot. And this full name has a octothorpe, a hashtag, right? And this is a pretty clear way you can visually see things. Dot means this is a class method. The hashtag means it's on an instance of the class. So I can't say user.fullName. That wouldn't work. It's not a class method. What I'm going to be writing is my user object right there, and I'm going to be writing full name on it. So this is just a way that you can visually talk about the difference between class methods and instance methods here. All right. So the next big point I want to talk about is that it is bad practice as much as possible to create things in the test database for your tests. What we could do here is we could say, and create a user. But then that user's in the test database. And so there's a whole mechanism to erase your test database, to reverse your test database. So we try to not do that as much as possible. And so that's one of the things of RSpec. That's one of the things everywhere. Creations and databases are test killers. I'll tell a quick story, a fictional, perhaps, story about a place where I worked where we had 500 tests that ran in 30 minutes. And removing the database creation portion of the test and stubbing objects, which we'll look at here, got those tests down to 20 seconds. So it's a significant time savings to be able to not create tests. And this is going to be our next library. This library is called Factory Bot. And Factory Bot allows us to pretend in our tests that we have database objects. There we go. So we're going to install that. Yeah, factories are great. It's amazing. So we have FactoryBot, and there's a couple of little things here that, and I'll just plug. FactoryBot comes from a company called ThoughtBot, and ThoughtBot is a great company. They do a lot of consulting for people's Rails projects, but they've given a lot of stuff back to the Ruby and Rails community as well. So ThoughtBot is where this comes from. So we're going to go into spec. We're going to make a new folder called support, and we're going to make our file that will hold the FactoryBot config. And this FactoryBot config is really tiny right now. You know what? If I actually called it FactoryBot, that would be better, wouldn't it? Okay. And so right now, this FactoryBot is just here. The other great thing about Rails is you can open up objects wherever, right? So this RSpec configure is in a lot of different files. This is in the spec helper, it's in the Rails helper, but here we're actually only including the FactoryBot config here. So we always know where it is, right? Which is pretty nice. And then let's go to the Rails helper real quick. All right, and you can see there was our shoulda matchers config. There is actually RSpec config in here as well, right here. So this RSpec configure and this RSpec configure both work, right? And it's pretty nice. So let's go up here and we're going to do the require, which will load the FactoryBot support into our Rails environment for the tests. All right, and that's all we need to do. So let's make a factory. And we're going to start with a user factory. FactoryBot has great documentation, so I'm just copy pasting in, right? But you can feel free to look at it. And that's it. So we define a factory user, and it infers that we're going to be talking about our user model. And right now we're just going to institute a first name and a last name on this. There are faker libraries that you can make, fake names right now, but for our purposes right now, that's all we have to do. So let's go back to the user spec and let's start testing this. So our first spec, we're gonna write the spec first. We haven't written the full name method yet, have we? And this is how you define a factory. Let is a way to establish a variable that doesn't get loaded until the test calls for it, and then it gets reloaded per test. It's called lazy loading, which is really nice. So we're going to establish this variable user, and the syntax is to build a user from the user factory. And look, I can override the John Doe, I think is what I said in the factory. I can override it here at at my test. And so now we have this user, and let's actually just look at this. So this is that pry that I was talking about, right? And let's run this. So there is no user object built in memory yet until now. And now there is this specific user object, and you can say there's the first name, there's the last name, and here it is. Notice there's no ID, right? I didn't stub an ID. I don't need the ID. All I'm dealing with right here is talking about a full name. And so we've got the bare minimum we need to prove our future full name function. So let's do this. And our test is going to be this, that we expect if the user has a first and a last name. And what we do is we expect the user, and look, when we call user in our test, that's where that object's going to get instantiated. And we expect user.fullName to equal the Parham. Now, will it equal the Parham right now? Let's find out. I think the general consensus would be no. No, because look, undefined method full name. Great. So running our test and our test failing really helps influence what we need to do here. And that's kind of a powerful part of this. We don't have a full name method yet. Okay, now we have a full name method. Let's run that test again and see what happens. Okay, it expected Lee Parham, but it got nil because I'm not returning anything, right? So one way to get your test to pass. There you go. Great. If I was the only user here, this would be great, and that's what we would need, right? But it's not. So let's do this for real. String interpolation in Ruby is really easy. We can say first name, sorry, and we can say space last name. And because this is an instance method, it's running on my user here. And so it can reference the first name, it can reference last name. And so what we're going to have coming out is the first name with the space and then the last name. Save that and let's run it now. And there we go. It works. Now, the tricky business comes back and says, wait a minute, not all of our users are going to have first names. Not all of our users are going to have last names. So how will this work if we don't have a first name or a last name? And we're going to get to our next big powerful thing about RSpec here. And I'm just going to copy all this in, and then we're going to take a look at it. Is context. And I think other test libraries have context, but contexts allow us, sorry, formatting gets me. Contexts allow us to describe multiple scenarios within the same test. And this is a really powerful thing about tests, and a really good thing about unit tests is getting all the edge cases in there. And so let's run this. Oh, there we go. Let's run this with documentation format. I only ever typically run my tests in the documentation format. And what this becomes is a new developer's documentation about your model, about your everything, right? And it reads like user associations is expected to have many addresses. User full name, when there is a first and last name, that's our context. This is the expectation, returns first name. And this is our future functionality. When there's only a first name, returns first name only. When there's a last name, returns last name only. So these contexts are really powerful. Context can be nested as deep as you want, but you can see describe, full name, then the context, and each of these is within its own block. And then there's the expectation. There is single line expectations, but I think this reads better because I'm dumb. And a month from now, I'll forget what I wrote. And this is easy for me to go back and to revisit and to read. So I think this is a really powerful thing. Okay, so let's go from there. And what is great about this is we could redefine user in this context. We could redefine user in this context, and we could redefine user here. However, what becomes really powerful is this. We can say first name, Lee. We can say last name. then we can reference those here. Now, this test should still pass. You know, if I didn't. Great. Our test still passes, right? This is the other benefit, is you can refactor stuff like crazy. And as long as your test still passes, you have confidence what it is. Now, let's redefine this. So in this context, what's the difference? There is a first name, right? And the first name is Lee. And there is not a last name. In the database, that would be considered nil. And what we would expect to see equal is called the matcher here. We're expecting what we're testing to equal what we expect it to say, right? So we would expect the full name to equal Lee. Right, that's the business case here. And so let's run this and see what happens. Uh-oh, we failed. Because what I expect is Lee with no space. What I got was Lee, but don't forget when we interpolated, we put that space in there. So what we can do is we can just rstrip. Rstrip means take the value off the right side of the string. If it's a trailing space, we'll trail. And it passes. Great. Now the opposite of this. And excuse my formatting, right? This should be prettier, but I don't want to do pretty right now. I just want to kind of expose a lot of this. Nil. And our last name now. Parham. And what we'd expect to see is Parham. All right. And do we think we're going to get Parham here? No, because of that tricky little interpolated space. Now the space is there. And so Ruby also includes strip. And now this passes, and great. However, let's make sure all of our tests pass still, because we've been messing with the model, and they all pass. Here's what's great. Look at this. At 0.2 seconds to run all the tests, right? It's nice. Loading the Rails infrastructure took a whole 1 second. Ruby also includes a method that's just called strip. And strip does preceding and trailing spaces. But did it work? You know how we can tell is, do our tests still pass? Yes, they are. Okay, great. So we have built a user.fullname feature, and we can cash in for the day and go home. But now we have to actually start building that tricky XML string. And that XML string is a little bit more difficult, right? We have some formatting to do. So we're going to use a quick pattern that is called the Interactor Pattern. Interactors are a way to extract out your business logic into self-contained little classes that have great functionality as far as rolling back things, providing information about if it's successful, if not. There's a lot to interactors that we're not getting into today, but it's kind of my preferred way to interface with this. There we go. And we're just going to put it here. And my linting is going to yell at me because it's not alphabetized, but that's okay. All right. So with this interactor, I'm going to copy a whole bunch of code in for time purposes, and then we're going to figure out what we need to do. But we know we're going to be building this query, right? And this query has an address. So we need to build our address factory real quick, because we know we're going to also we all know we're also going to need an address factory. So we're just going to do this real quick. And we don't need it for our purposes, but there are mechanisms to build the user as well. So when you define an address, the address will have a user associated with it already, but we don't need that for right now. All right. So what we're going to do is I'm going to build my Interactor Spec first. All right, blank file. And ta-da, we have a spec written. Let's take a look at this, right? When we saw that here, this query string, and I'm talking about everything from this XML on, this is all XML. And there's some XML builders out there, but for our purposes, we're gonna build the string. And what I would expect is this is the credential I encoded earlier. And so it's encrypted within my app, and this is how I can reference it. What I would expect to see is this long string that then has the full name of the user, that method we just used. It's gonna have the street, it's gonna have the city, it's gonna have the state, it's gonna have the zip code, and it's gonna have all this other stuff here. That's what I want my query builder to do. And let's see if it does. Let's make a blank template holder file for our interactor. Oh. We're going to split above and below for now. The query string right now is going to have this. This is all well documented as well. And we're going to return not the end goal here. We're going to return okay. How does that work? No. What we expected was our query string. What we got was XML. So let's take a look at what we did here. What I defined a user, right, for our user factory. I defined an address, and look, right here, I associated that address with the user. And then I have this called right here, described class. Notice this gets used a lot. When I describe this with RSpec, I pass in the class name. The class name is build query string. So I can reference it with described class and then .call. And then the interactor pattern, it requires you pass in a key value pair of any information you want to pass in. And I'm passing in the address. And what I expect out is the formatted query string here. What gets returned is that context, and it doesn't equal that yet. So let's build the query string. And for our purposes today, ta-da, it's done. I've extracted out referencing the user. I've extracted out referencing the address so that the query string is right here. And I use this great little thing in Ruby called hereDoc, which you can multi-line and it turns into a string. And we have to do a little bit of sanitization on the string to get rid of new lines and stuff like that. But that's a small penalty to pay for a much more readable XML, I think. Because that's the actual XML. If it were in an XML body, it'd be great. And there it is. So what our code here does is it calls build query string, and then it squishes. And squish means let's remove all new line characters from this string. And then there is a space that is remaining where that new line character was at the end of a key value pair in the beginning of the next one. So we can strip those out in there. So now what comes back is, let's see what comes back. Here I've interrupted our method. We're going to call it context. And the context, this interactor, provides all this back. And one of the things it provides back is XML body. You can reference it. And that's what we need right there. And it passes. So we have pretty quickly defined this. And the good news is, if I ever change the method here, right? This is the other big thing. What if somebody came in here and they said zip3? And they changed the functionality of our method. This is going to fail. And you can see here. So this provides us a little bit of safety that we have defined the functionality of our app in our tests, and then the test won't pass if somebody's changed it without also accounting for it in their test. All right. We're going to do one more quick thing, and that's going to be to make the actual call to the USPS. The actual USPS service. And we're going to put the code in, and then we're going to talk about it. These interactors all have this call thing, and it's typically a common pattern for the part that doesn't ever change to just paste it into a constant and freeze that constant to make it immutable. So we can't overwrite that. We just know that that's defined there, and that's what we want. And now let's write the spec file for this. Yeah. So the other big thing about tests is that we're going to be contacting a third-party service. Do we want to pay the API fees every time we run our test suite to actually go hit the real service? No, we don't. And so the other big thing that you do a lot is you mock requests to external services. And what you can do is you can mimic going out and actually hitting the service, and you can fake responses coming back. So you can test what happens if it's a 200, what happens if it's a 404, what happens if it's a 503. You can write mocks to say, whenever I go hit this URL, what I want you to return is a specific status code with a specific body. And there's a great library called WebMock that does this. And so we're going to add that real quick to our library. Bottom, because we only want to WebMock in the test environment. Then we have to include the files, and we do that through the spec helper. There's a lot of Rails magic going on here, right? And I agree, it's kind of crazy sometimes, the stuff that we can just do, and that's fine. I mean, I'll take advantage of it if we can, right? So we're going to include this here. That allows us to write the libraries for that. So let's go back now to our call USPS, and we're going to put the test in. Excuse me. So this yeah, I don't care about Docker right now. So our context, our interactor context, is the call USPS call. We're going to pass in that XML body that we previously created, and we're going to return. So we make a URI, universal URL, and that references the verify URL plus the XML body, and it will return this response. And right now, we don't care about the response yet, right? We just care that it works. And that's all we're doing here. So here, look at this block right here. It says before. So you can write hooks, before hooks, after hooks, that you can define. I want this to run before every of my tests. And this is the webmock. This is going to stub a request, a post request to that URI, and it's going to return a status with that body into it. And all we care about right now is that it does actually do that. And it doesn't. Look, we got nil. Why did we get nil? It's because we haven't written call yet. And so what we're going to do is we're going to bring in the library. And we have the URL, and we're going to include what we're going to return. We're going to return XML response. And this is a very common pattern as well. I could put all my business logic here in this method to do it, but we don't want to expose that business logic. So we can define private methods, methods that cannot be called outside of this. And that's where we put all of our business logic. It's one of those little patterns that you'll see a lot in this. And so we make the URI, we post with that URI, and we don't have a body. You have to define a body. We don't have one because it's all in it. And then we're going to read the body of the response. Stub that, and so that test passes now as well. I'm not going to write the test for this because I think we're running low on time. But what we will do is the interactors also can be organized into groups, which is nice, and that we will use that. So what that means is that I have to build the body of the XML, and then I have to pass that body on to the requester. And that is going to be done here. USPS, hire. Notice that we make very, very single responsibility objects. All that XML body builder does is build the XML string. So obviously I didn't go into all the edge cases. What if there isn't a city? What if there's a state? A lot of validation that we maybe need to do for real. But all that little thing I built does is build an XML string. All my USPS interface does is make the post and read the response, right? This makes it very easy to write tests in small consumable chunks. It's a very common thing. And so this organizer is this. And what this means is, okay, if I call this organizer and I pass in the address that this requires, this is going to build the XML body, and that XML body is going to be passed into my call command. And that's it. It is done, right? So let's run the entire test suite real quick. I have that try in there, so let me go remove that. Yeah, so that caught that. So all of our tests pass. And now okay, we have that address. And now we're going to see if it works. If I could type, it would work, wouldn't it? Okay, Rails magic here. I called it verifier in the file name, and so I have to call it that in the class as well. Okay, well, obviously I've done something wrong there, and so we will oh, hey, you know why? Because I built the spec file first. And here we are. We actually went out and called, and here's the response back. And the response back includes, notice, that zip4 filled in now. And that's it. We were able to write tests. We're able to be relatively secure, and we can sleep tonight that our code will work as expected. So I'd like to open it up for any discussion, comments, questions. We can go from there.
Sorry, I'm trying to like fix it here. Yeah, so I got some questions. Let me move over and get in the screen. So first, quickly, I guess, as a pre-question, have you used other testing frameworks besides RSpec for Ruby?
So the other big one is called mini test, and I've used mini test some as well. But mini test is in, you'll see in mostly mini test in a lot of the tutorials and that sort of stuff. But every production code base I've ever worked on has used RSpec. I think that describe, context, syntax reads a little bit better, and the ability to output documentation, some of those things seem to read better for production level code bases. We have 4,000 tests in our current code base.
Wow.
Yeah.
So I think you kind of briefly touched on this, but what what reasons would you choose RSpec over, was it mini test or
Yeah.
like shoulda or something like that?
So yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Miguel. Yeah.
I think you might have got an echo or something.
Oh, okay. So I mean, at the end of the day, they're both tools. And so likely a developer going into a code base isn't going to get to choose, right? There's going to already be one established, or there's going to be an architect or a senior developer that likes one or the other. For me, RSpec just is easier. It comes under my hands faster. I've written it long enough now that that's just going to be my go-to, right? It's well maintained. There's a lot of great support around it, a lot of great documentation. And at the end of the day, that's what it is. I can go home earlier if I write my test earlier, right? So that's how I can get my job done securely, confidently, and quickly.
Great.
Cool. Would you say RSpec is a good testing suite for like a new developer?
It really is. Yeah. So I think if you go pretty quickly through it, and if you look at the better specs here, and then RSpec comes through. Yeah, right there. RSpec comes through the relish, and their documentation is incredibly good. And I think pretty quickly you'll be able to get in and write some basic tests and go really straightforward. Right, the little setup stuff I did at the beginning is well documented as well. So the resources are out there to get set up. Now, the one thing, Minitest does come out of the box with Rails. So if you're going through a tutorial and it's Minitest, use Minitest, right? Just get in the habit of writing tests, and then you can pick a framework choice if you want to.
So then how would you technically start approaching learning TDD in general, right? Like forget the libraries and everything.
Yeah.
What's a good approach for TDD?
It sucks. The good approach is to force yourself to write the test first. Now, in reality, am I going to write a test knowing it's going to fail? No. But I will absolutely in parallel do it. And the other benefit that I found is that if I'm developing a feature, I'm trying to track down a bug, I'm going to write a failing scenario first. And then I don't have to go to my website and click around. What happens if I fill out the form this way and click submit? No, I can just go write the test to do it for me, right? So it is a slow process at first. It's a pain, but it becomes second nature quickly.
So would you say that like working with your with a team has made it like TDD has made it a lot easier to catch bugs?
Oh yeah, I can only sleep at night. The company I work for now, we do financial transactions, hundreds of millions of dollars a year of financial transactions, right? And we go withdraw money from people's bank accounts. Like I couldn't sleep at night if we wrote something that accidentally triple withdrawed money or didn't withdraw money or deposited all of our money into the right. Like it's, and on a team, it's just the way that we can feel secure that everyone's doing their stuff, because we can't read, I don't know, 3 million lines of code, whatever it is, right? And so we have to trust the tests that are there, and that's the only way we can do it.
I mean, I'll be happy if it messed up and add in a couple extra zeros in my bank account, right?
Exactly. Right.
Like I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
So now that you brought that up, like very large code bases, right? And then bringing in new developers, right? Does having tests kind of allow them to more easily be able to be onboarded, and they're kind of like it becomes like a catch-all where like it stops from like people having mistakes, right? Because it's such a large code base, and they're working on one small part, and then it allows them to not mess up, right, quote unquote.
Yeah. Well, and the way that's right. And the way we wrote the test here, it becomes documentation. So like in several places I've worked, we've had some pretty good processes in place to require tests and the context structure, all this stuff. So if I'm getting into a new thing I haven't used before, I have to fix a bug in some service object, I'm going to run the test suite first. I'm going to read the documentation. I'm going to put prize in the different tests. I'm going to start to learn through the tests how the code works.
Oh, that's sounds like a great approach. Actually, never thought about it that way.
Right.
Because like I'm really more about like let me get the code done, and like TDD seems to be like a new approach, right? Essentially.
Well, for the
Um,
Ruby world, it's the old approach, right?
okay.
That's why these tools are so well established.
Okay.
It's the way.
Yeah, because just looking at that and compared to, I mean, I haven't used too many testing stuff, but yeah, the Ruby ones seem to be very polished. Most of the testing I done have been with Laravel projects in the PHP world. And they've done a really good job about, you know, setting up migrations, factories, testing, being able to, they have something called Tinker, which is really cool. So basically it's like a command line. You just start writing code and it just runs it for you, starts testing for you. It's really cool. And then you can just like completely close out of it and it cleans your entire code back up again. And it's really awesome. So you can real time test data without actually messing with your application, which is awesome. But yeah.
So for us, the benefit is that these get integrated into Circle CI, right? So when I left my current company, now we had it. Once you made the merge into master, it ran the test suite, it auto deployed, but it wouldn't deploy if the test didn't pass, right? And we had it set up to where on an old version of the way we ran tests, the whole test suite took 4 hours to run, and we could parallelize it inside Circle CI to take 10 minutes to run. So if we needed to, we could make a change, click merge, and 10 minutes later, it's live in the app. And so that unlocks multiple deploys a day. We started deploying 4 or 5 times a week because our test suite was there and we were confident in that. So we want to deploy something. Okay, let's deploy today. No biggie.
Sounds like it would be a good approach for agile development, right? When you're just constantly deploying and not having to roll anything back.
That's right.
Cool.
What about so would you say that test-driven development gets you to write cleaner code? If you know, because I mean the model is right, you write your tests first and then you do the code later.
Right. Yeah. So what we found out is if you have to stub 13 objects to get your service class to work, probably the service class isn't architected well, right? So writing the tests really helps expose holes in the code. Or if you have 25 contexts, because there's 25 different edge cases, what if it's this way, maybe there's a better way to architect the code. And so the tests definitely help clean code.
It's great. It seems just helpful in so many ways. I think it's just maybe the barrier of entry, or also like you know, a lot of places still don't use test-driven development, more like integration tests and stuff like that, right? But I feel like if you get a job somewhere or you get on a project that you don't do that kind of stuff, you're not going to be used to it. So just like Miguel, I'm not used to doing test-driven development. I've dabbled with it briefly with Jasmine and stuff like that, but yeah, it's really cool.
Well, the benefit of these patterns, right, is that like we have this interactor. So when you get to actually make the request, the controller is just going to call this interactor. And so all you have to do to test the request is say, hey, did my controller call the interactor? And that's one of the other things we didn't get to today is you can expect that messages get called on objects. So I could write a test that said, expect that my organizer that I ran from the command line, expect it receives call with this parameter. And then I go and I hit the request. And I don't care if it works or not, right? I know that it's going to get the call because I did all my testing on the actual service object itself. And so you're right. I mean, there are integration tests and there still is a need for that. But if we really flesh out the unit tests and make them really atomic, I think it alleviates a lot of the need for the heavy lifting integration tests that are out there.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. Kind of making me think about our community projects that we're starting. That maybe we should implement some kind of testing aspects to it. It would help a lot with automation and allowing people to push code and auto merge without
it's
us
slow
having
at
to really,
first. Right.
and then like generally like a lot of the approaches I've seen with companies is you kind of have your QA people or like your DevOps people kind of handle some of the testing, and I just do all the code. And then you have another dev team writing all the unit tests, right?
Right.
It seems to be the use case now is that as you go and develop, you should probably, since if you're writing the code, you should probably write the unit test, right? Instead of having it be separate.
Yeah, the goal is the short feedback loop as possible, right? And if the test suite is running good enough, you can run the entire code base test suite on your own machine, right? And so before you even make a PR, you can make sure that you didn't, there's regression in place that you can make sure you didn't break something else unintentionally.
So I want to kind of circle back to at the beginning when you mentioned that you did a test that took 30 minutes and it dropped it down to 20 seconds. So TDD helps you become a better developer in writing clean code. Now, how do you become a good developer writing good TDD code, right? Or does it just go hand in hand?
It does, and for me, even prepping for this, I had to wait a minute. What was the syntax for X? I couldn't remember, right? But the documentation is out there such that it's at your fingertips, and there's a million other. And this may be indicative of the Rails and the Ruby world, but there's a million other developers that ran into the same problem, right? And so I can go find somebody else's repo that did it, or I can go find a Medium article or something where somebody's already figured it out. And that's kind of the open source mantra, and something that we all try to do is give back. And that TDD is one of those things. And it's been a long road, right? Only about 3 years in did it really start to make sense to become really efficient. And I've established these patterns that I like to use, right? But yeah, just it's out there.
Okay, yeah, awesome. So we have a few minutes left. What advice would you give to, I mean, our community is mainly a lot of early developers are getting into tech, especially like at the beginning, if you're learning and becoming a developer, should your focus be TDD from the beginning, right? Because I know there's like a lot of tutorials, they cover a lot of simple stuff like to do, but they don't really cover, hey, let's do the TDD stuff, even though it seems like simple enough at the beginning, but getting into that habit, right? Do you think there's like a lack of like TDD early on tutorials? Because it seems like a lot of TDD stuff is more like you're already an established developer, you should probably learn TDD, not at the
Now
beginning.
let's learn Cypress or something like that.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Yeah. No, and this may just be the Ruby bent, right? Because there's a book out there called Rails Tutorial by a great guy named Michael Hartle. And from the beginning, you're writing tests. Like you have to set up your test infrastructure before you ever write a line of code. But you're right. I mean, it's going to be a balance. If this is a fun project and it's going to be you consuming it, maybe you don't write tests. Or maybe you get it working, and then there's no hard and fast rule. Like I almost in this thing here where I'm preaching TDD, just wrote the model first, right? Wrote the method first, and then wrote the test around it. So, I think if you just start, anyone just starts getting into it a little bit, it just will become second nature because it makes your life a lot easier and saner off hours that your code's covered.
That's great to hear. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like if you're just starting to learn, right, you have to know the basics of whatever language it is, right? You got to learn programming basics too, data types, all that kind of stuff, right?
Yep.
But it's hard to gauge at what point exactly you should really shift that focus, because you could learn the basics all day, but getting into actually building an application is a whole nother can of worms.
Yeah.
And so I can definitely see like the huge impact that it could have. I guess it's just paying that initial price of getting it going, right?
Yeah.
For companies and for developers.
And that may make a case for using the out-of-the-box tools, right? Rails ships out of the box with unit tests, so it's already there. The infrastructure is already in place. You just got to write the test. So that may make a case, especially for young developers, newer developers within a language, to use the easiest tools of entry, even if maybe they're not the best at production scale, right? Figure that part out later.
All right. Well, Lee, I really appreciate you taking the time to come visit with us and to give an awesome talk on Ruby and test-driven development, really. So we really appreciate you coming by.
No, Thank you.
Thank
I
you.
really appreciate it. I love these sorts of things, and I think it's great to get with other communities. So I appreciate the opportunity.
Perfect. So I just want to be mindful of everybody's time. We're right at that hour mark. And real quick, I just wanted to say that once a month, Northwest Arkansas Coders has guest speakers like Lee come in and do awesome things and help teach people or expose them to different tech stacks or different areas of tech. And that's all just to help you learn and grow. We also have other community driven things. If you want to go to our website at nwacoders.com, you'll be able to get more information there. And with that, I will go ahead and end it.